Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second session with Dr. Ron Duncan Hart, exploring Crypto Jews, the long journey. Thank you all for joining us again this week. As a reminder, please send all questions or send us all your questions using the Q&A button on your screen, and we'll facilitate those at the end of the lecture. The first session is actually up on our website if you want to review it or go back. And we are hoping, barring any technical issues, to have this session posted later this week. I know you're all eager to dive right into the subject. So with that, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Ron Duncan Hart. Hi, Dr. Hart. The screen is yours.
Okay, thank you, Matt. And it's a pleasure for me to be here as a part of this program with the Haberman Institute. And we'll pick up kind of where we left off from last week. To all of you who sent in questions, thank you for those questions, and hope we can answer some of them today. This history, of course, is a complex and a long history, and it might be impossible to cover all of your questions, but I will make suggestions for readings at the end of the talk today. And for those of you who are interested in getting more into the subject, there will be some critical books to use. Okay, let's go back and pick up where we were last week, and we'll start with this process. So Matt, just to check, you have the screen with the 6 faces?
Yeah, I see it. Looks good.
Okay. As I showed this last week also, and these are friends and acquaintances who have shared their experiences with me, and it's in many ways part of their story that we'll be looking at today. So let's pick up from this. We will be looking at, last week we looked at the first period of Jewish Converso and Crypto Jewish life, which was the first 200 years between 1350 and 1550. That was primarily in Spain and Portugal. That was the time of the Inquisition, pressure from the church for Jews to convert. And today we're going to be looking at the subsequent stages that bring us more into the Americas. From 1550 to 1650 is the major period of Jewish converso activity in the Americas that was, although not completely open, but it was much more open than it would become later. Especially Portuguese conversos were coming. Remember that part of the story. The conversos and crypto Jews from Spain seemed to be largely gone at that point, either having assimilated or having moved to Amsterdam, to Eastern Europe, or to the Muslim countries. But so what we get here, it's Portuguese converso families that are basically left, and they are the ones who are coming to the Americas in large numbers. They were helping build the European societies in the Americas, both in the good and bad aspects of that. And they actually continued to live for decades, even centuries after this time period that we're looking at. So, but in the beginning, they controlled, during this period, 1550, 1650, they controlled much of the trade with the Spanish territories. And although the central authorities of the Spanish crown still wanted to eradicate Jews from Spanish territories, but the colonial officials in the Americas were frequently much more lax in doing that. Because the Portuguese conversos who were here many times were merchants, they tended to be wealthy. They brought trade goods, they invested, and even part of the story we'll see is they brought slaves, which was building the labor infrastructure in the Americas. They made investments, they made colonies grow. And the actual fact is that colonial officials frequently were friends with these Portuguese conversos because they were some of the few Europeans that were in the colonies. So they had the same education levels, they tended to be friends. But in the 1630s and the 1640s, after that grand conspiracy event that we saw where the Dutch actually took over Recife and a big part of Brazil, the Spanish crown was afraid the same thing would happen to them, and they ordered the Inquisition to arrest the Converso business leaders in Lima and in Cartagena. Later, it would happen in Mexico City. And in an attempt to rid the colonies of Jews, because Jews were seen as an unreliable fifth column within the colonies. And so the Spanish crown was using the Inquisition here as a political instrument. So they were getting rid of the Portuguese Jews, not so much because of the religious practice, but because they felt that they were Portuguese and not loyal to the Spanish crown. During this time, the wealthy Jews tended to leave or to reconcile with the church, to stay, sometimes to protect their properties, while the Jews that did not have those same resources tended to go into hiding. If they didn't have the resources to leave or go elsewhere, their only choice was to go into deeper hiding. And it's that group that we began to find a good part of our story. Now, the third stage, which we'll also have a chance to look at today, a long stage from 1650 to 1950, this 300-year period, is what we call the Twilight Zone, because there are virtually no Inquisition records of crypto Jews at this point. The Inquisition was abolished, and the records tend to disappear. So we don't have much information about this time period. But what we do know, this is kind of like a black box, if you, in the psychology 101 experiments, which we saw them, we know what went into the black box in 1650. We know what came out of it in 1950, because in 1950 on, we start getting people telling the stories of their family and the Jewish practices that were preserved, although we don't have much information of what was going on in the middle. And the last stage that we see, which is the one we're living now, is 1950 to the present. This is the time of the reawakening and the Jewish identity movement that has been growing dramatically across, from the American Southwest, across much of Latin America. So by 1650, the centuries-long experiment in the Americas of Jewish conversos and crypto Jews being important actors in the new societies of Latin America, that was coming to an end. The Jewish presence it was shifting into the Caribbean, Dutch, and English colonies, which began to replace the Spanish as centers of maritime commerce. So in Spanish colonies, they had to live as hidden Jews or crypto Jews. People would move into Curacao, Jamaica, the Guyanas, where the British and the Dutch were, and they could come back to living openly as Jews, and that was happening. The Jewish conversos that stayed in the Latin American colonies, such as in Cartagena and in Lima and Mexico, began to fade from the public records. We don't have much information on them, but they did become prominent in these English and Dutch colonies. For example, in North America, just at the end of the talk last time, I mentioned about Sharif Israel and the Portuguese Converso descendants who arrived there, the 23 who arrived in 1654. All of the early synagogues in what is to be the United States, the 13 colonies, were set up by Portuguese Converso descendants from New York to Newport, Philadelphia, Mikveh Israel, Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans. These are all called Sephardic synagogues today because they're people who return to Sephardic practice. And that's the thing that was happening across the Americas. There's another interesting phenomenon also that the question comes up, who was a Jewish converso and who was a crypto Jew in the Americas? Who was hiding and who wasn't hiding? And there was a sliding identity between openly practicing Jews and hidden Jewish conversos. People could take on the identity according to where they lived. This case, Blas de Paz Pinto in Cartagena had lived in Salonika as an openly practicing Jew and apparently had studied to be a rabbi. When he came to Cartagena to seek his fortune, he became a hidden Jew because it was illegal to be a Jew in lands controlled by the Spanish crown. Now, I've never found any evidence that he actually converted, but he was an illegal hidden Jew. And the interesting thing is he led the minyan in Cartagena. There was a minyan that met regularly, and it met in his house, which in this photo is the house at the end on the right, the two-story house, just beyond the blue house. The house still exists, and that was where the minyan met there. So we have many cases like this of people who were living as crypto Jews when they were in Spanish territory or Portuguese lands, and then going back to living openly as Jews when they would move to English or Dutch or Muslim lands. Another example of this is we find in Newport. Aaron Lopez in Newport is an example of an important Portuguese crypto Jew returnee to Judaism. He was born Duarte Lopez in Portugal in a Converso family. But at the age of 21, in the mid 1700s, he followed his older brother to Newport. The older brother had already moved there, returned to the full practice of Judaism, changed his name to Moshe, to a Jewish name. And when Duarte arrived to Newport, he changed his name to Aaron, like he was known for the rest of his life. And during this time, interestingly, Newport, like Amsterdam, was a destination for Jews of Portuguese descent, including conversos returning to Jewish practice. It was a destination for them to go and to live. Lopez became the wealthiest businessman in Newport. He helped fund the Toro Synagogue there, which still exists, and he made contributions to the institution that was to become Brown University. He had various businesses, from candle making to chocolate making, making rum and barrels and so on. But he also owned ships, and his ships were involved in the slave trade, much like the Portuguese conversos that dominated that trade up to the 1650s. And he got into that when he came. This is his wife, Sarah, and their son, Joshua. So just as these Portuguese families were arriving as Jews on the east coast of North America, their crypto-Jewish cousins were arriving into the American Southwest. So let's look at that story. The area, they came into Mexico through the port of Veracruz, and Veracruz is here, if you can see that. Mexico City was a prime location for people, as was Guadalajara, Puebla, Veracruz, we mentioned already, Acapulco, Zacatecas. Now, Veracruz and Acapulco were important because they were port cities, and Jews were very much involved in navigation, as we talked about last time, Portuguese Jews especially. So they were always in the port cities. Zacatecas was a mining center, and as was Tasco further south. And there were significant converso populations in those cities. So mining was a major thing that attracted some of these people coming in. So Veracruz, we can see here one of the colonial buildings left from that time. As the crypto-Jewish families or converso families would arrive into Veracruz, there was a network of assistance to helping them get oriented. And the house of Fernando Rodriguez in Veracruz was a safe house for crypto-Jews, conversos, and he would help orient them and get them connected with other converso families in the interior of the country, in the cities that we've seen earlier. In Mexico City, for example, the contact was Antonio Baez. He was a community leader. He held seders in his house. He was known for visiting Converso families who were ill or in need and helping them because he was a wealthy member of the community. He was arrested eventually by the Inquisition, but his work was continued by his son and by others, such as Margarita de Rivera, who was in charge of Tejada and for Jewish burials. Miguel Tinoco, who was in charge he was the matzah maker, and he provided that for Passover. One of the interesting things that in relation to this for Passover, apparently, one of the things that people began to use in the Americas was using tortillas, corn tortillas, which are unleavened, as acceptable for Passover. So that's one of the crypto-Jewish practice that apparently was adopted. So these communities were organized around extended families. Usually they had a patron-client relationship in which the leader of the community usually was a wealthier member. There was usually a wealthy patron as the head of it. And one example of this, which has become legendary, is the Luis Carvajal family. Many claim descent from this family today because it's become a kind of nobility among people who identify with crypto-Jewish ancestry. And Luis Carvajal de la Cueva was a governor of an important region, the region of León in northeastern Mexico. He was the rich and powerful uncle of this family and of a larger network of people. Since he was the governor of this territory, he was given permission to bring Spanish settlers into his region, and he recruited 259 people who were exempt from the usual requirement of proving the limpieza de sangre, or the purity of blood, because if you came to the Americas, you had to prove that you had no Jewish blood or no Muslim blood. And he got an exemption from that, partly because of his, unknown to the crown, he did have a connection with crypto-Jewish families. In fact, his sister, Francisca Núñez de Carvajal, was an active crypto-Jew, and she came with her family, her children, and there were other families that were identified later as crypto-Jewish conversos. Now, the area that he was the governor of today is known as Nuevo León. You can see this area in northeastern Mexico. It's around the city of Monterrey. And around that city today, there still is a community of descendants of these early Converso settlers. And there's a very interesting history and study done there by the Israeli anthropologist Shulamit Halevi that gives the indication, the reference to these families today. So the problem was that Luis Carvajal, even though he was governor, he was accused of being of Judaizing, and he was arrested in 1588 by the Inquisition. On trial, he was actually acquitted of Judaizing, but he was convicted of knowingly having Judaizers among his settlers and not reporting them to the Inquisition. For that crime, that religious crime, he was sentenced to exile from Mexico, but he died in the Inquisition jail before he could be deported. So the arrest of Governor Luis Carvajal was a high-profile case that alerted crypto-Jews to the dangers they were facing in Mexico. Now, the governor's nephew, who was also named Luis, was an active crypto-Jew, and he was encouraging others to return to the practice of the law of Moses, which is what being Jewish was called at that time, the law of the Torah. And he really has become, it's him, Luis Carvajal the Younger, who has become the most famous person in crypto-Jewish history coming out of Mexico. His full name is Luis de Carvajal El Mozo. El Mozo is simply meaning the younger one, the younger Luis Carvajal. And under other circumstances, he might have succeeded his uncle as governor, but Judaism became the passion of his life once he learned as a young man that the family was Jewish. Now, it was quite common for crypto-Jewish families to keep the secret from their children until they were teenagers or old enough to mature enough to keep the secret. So it was not unusual that Luis Carvajal the younger didn't know it until he became a young man. It's a common practice that I've heard many families tell me today, even. But when he learned the family was Jewish, he also was able to get some parts, at least, of the 5 books of Moses. Now, it was illegal to have Bibles in the Spanish colonial period because the idea was that people should not have the Bibles because they didn't know how to interpret it. So only the church could have them. But he was able to get the 5 books of Moses. And as he began reading this, he found, for example, the Jewish practice of circumcision, which he didn't know about. He circumcised himself. He began to encourage other men, young men that he knew were crypto-Jews, to circumcise or to be circumcised themselves. As he read more and more about the law of Moses, he became more convinced that this was the way of life that needed to be followed. He didn't really know exactly what it meant to be Jewish because there were it had been kept a secret from him. His mother began to tell him about family practices. He read what he could from the books of the Torah he was able to get. And the other interesting, curious thing is the Inquisition itself put out a list of what they identified as Jewish practices. Lighting candles on Friday night, not eating pork, not working on Shabbat or Saturday, things of that sort. So by this combination of the list of prohibited activities by the Inquisition, biblical sources, and his own family teachings, he was able to reconstruct or re-Judaize. And we find this a common practice for people who are coming back at that time. Now, he also, while he was in the Inquisition jail, he also began writing down his understanding of what it was to be Jewish. And this has become the most complete statement we have of a crypto Jew coming out of this period. And we can see here, this is his actual journal where he wrote all of this out. It still exists. And it's a great resource today. Now, his mother, Francisca, and his sisters, Isabel, Catalina, Mariana, and Leonor, were all arrested by the Inquisition along with Luis in 1589. And this is the process from Leonor. So you can see it says Doña Leonor de Carvajal. You probably can't read the lower writing, but it mentions that she's from a family that's been arrested by Inquisition, and that her husband is a Portuguese. Now, since it was assumed if you're Portuguese, you're Jewish, this is kind of saying her parents, her siblings, her husband, everybody's Jewish, so she must be Jewish also. When they were arrested, they asked for mercy as first-time offenders, and they were given what was considered a light sentence of spending the next 5 years in a monastery, in being jailed, in a sense. They served out their sentences. They were released after the 5 years, but they had to make the promise to the church that they would not go back to Judaizing, to doing Jewish practices. But as things happened, when they got out, they did return to Jewish practice. Now, during this time, another interesting thing, Luis changed his name from Luis Carvajal to Joseph Lumbroso. Now, he picked Joseph from the biblical Joseph, who knew how to interpret dreams and foresee the future, and who became the prime minister of Pharaoh. Lumbroso in Spanish means shining or light. So in a sense, he took on the name of being a dreamer, someone who could see what was better, and a shining example of it, or an enlightened dreamer. So an interesting choice of his new name. In 1595, he was arrested again the second time, and he knew as a second offender what his fate would be. And apparently he attempted suicide to avoid the torture because he was afraid that he would reveal the names of other members of the crypto-Jewish community, which he didn't want to do. He was convicted of Judaizing, of course, second time, and he was sentenced to death. Now, an insight as to what was going on in this world at that time, showing the breakage that happened between families. His death sentence from the Inquisition was actually signed by a distant relative who was a converso, had joined the church and become a part of the Inquisition. And that person was actually related to the Pablo de Santa Maria family that we saw last week, the family that had been Rabbi Solomon Halevi, who converted and became the Archbishop of Burgos as Pablo Santa Maria. Now, one of his descendants here is signing the death certificate for Luis Carvajal. Luis and his mothers and sisters were all burned at the stake on December the 8th, 1596 in Mexico City. And in a gesture that the Inquisition considered was a gesture of mercy, they were all strangled before being burned so that they would not have to suffer the agony of being burned alive. So Luis de Carvajal has become a folk hero to descendants of crypto Jews across Mexico and New Mexico because of his martyrdom and his reputation for a passion for encouraging others to return to the practice of Judaism. The public displays of death or being burned at the stake for Jewish practice would have had an effect of driving crypto Jews to abandon their crypto Jewish practices or to go even deeper into hiding. And we believe that some of them actually left Mexico at this point. And one of their escape routes was Juan de Oñate. He was organizing, he'd been given a charter from the crown to settle the territories of the northern extreme of the Spanish Empire, outside of Mexico itself and into what is today called New Mexico. And he was organizing an expedition that actually started organizing in 1596 when the Carvajal family was burned at the stake. It actually left in 1598 and on its way to New Mexico. I think families, crypto-Jewish families that were there who saw the burning of a very important high-ranking family, the Carvajals, the governor of a province, many of them, some of them would have decided that it was time to get out of Mexico. And going to the northern extreme was one of the outlets for them. So Santa Fe, New Mexico, was 1,200 miles away from Mexico City. You can see on this map, Mexico City here, and all the way up to Santa Fe is a 1,200-mile journey on foot, crossing deserts in northern Mexico. This is a total desert area, very difficult and hazardous journey. And that was a way of protection from the Inquisition. There was no Inquisition in Santa Fe, and the long distance gave them some protection. Oñate's expedition included 130 families, 270 soldiers. They had wagons and carts and thousands of animals, from horses to cattle to oxen. When they arrived to the Rio Grande River at the place that is today called El Paso, which is in this area, El Paso simply means the crossing, the passing of the river. At that point, Oñate claimed all of the river basin of the Rio Grande as Spanish territory, this entire area from southern Colorado all through New Mexico, down through Texas. This included, of course, the area that Luis Carvajal had already settled with large numbers of Converso families. So this becomes the area of our focus that we'll be looking at. This is the heartland of where these Converso crypto-Jewish families were settling in this Rio Grande Valley, basically. Now, back in Mexico itself at this time, the last round of massive arrests for Judaizing was being made, and this happened in the 1640s. Portugal broke away from Spain, and Spain decided at that point that anybody of Portuguese descent would not be loyal to Spain, so they wanted to get rid of them. And the double implication here was Portuguese were usually Jews, so they suspected them for being Portuguese and for being Jewish, and the idea was they used the Inquisition to try to eliminate this population from Mexico because they, again, were seen as a fifth column and untrustworthy. During the 1640s, the Inquisition arrested 130 leaders of the crypto-Jewish communities in Mexico City. Now, we know that there were actually several thousand conversos. There was no way they could arrest all of them, but they arrested the leaders. In a sense, they decapitated the Jewish communities of their leadership. And we see the Inquisition here being used for political reasons, as it was in more than one case. The 80% of the people who were arrested during this time confessed to Judaizing. And most of those promised never to do it again, to try to get some leniency from the Inquisition. But in 1649, the largest auto de fe that was ever held in Mexico was with the sentencing of all of these people. And of those, 13 were sentenced to be burned at the stake. And that essentially pressured the crypto-Jewish Converso community in Mexico to go into deep hiding. Now, back in New Mexico, we know that the Converso families tended to seek more isolated areas, and they tended to seek out these mountain valleys like this one. The Spanish settlement was more focused on Spanish descent people, and so we find that people going to these more remote areas in the towns today, such as Mora and Dixon, which are known to have had crypto-Jewish families in the past. Now, they don't seem to be active now because most have left there, and they can now become open in their practicing of Judaism. They no longer have to hide, but these were places where it was known in the past. So we know that there were crypto-Jews and Jewish Converso families in New Mexico, but the only people actually to be arrested by the Inquisition for Judaizing was a governor of the territory, Bernardo Lopez de Mendizábal, and his wife and 4 of his lieutenants or colleagues. Now, during Don Bernardo's tenure as governor, he was repeatedly in conflict with the church, and he really alienated virtually every priest in the district. And he alienated them because he tended to be hostile toward the church. He rarely went to mass, didn't go to confession, so he broke all the rules to start with. Secondly, he insisted that if the church was going to force Indian laborers to build the churches, which they did, that they should pay them. Now, the church felt this was a hostile act because they wanted to conscript Indian labor to work for free to build the churches. So there was this hostility that Indians had to be paid for their labor. And secondly, Don Bernardo said that the indigenous communities should be able to continue their religious practices and their dances, which were an important part of the agricultural cycle, part of the calendrical year. The church said absolutely no. The indigenous people cannot continue their traditional ritual practices. And so there was a conflict between the governor and the church on this issue. Given all these problems, finally in 1662, he was accused by one of the local priests to the Inquisition in Mexico City for Judaizing. And as a result of that, he was arrested along with his wife, Doña Teresa Aguilera y Roche, as I mentioned before. And the dramatic nighttime arrest of Doña Teresa in the Palace of the Governors, which we see here, was filled with political intrigue. And it's described beautifully in the book by the anthropologist Francis Levine, which is called Doña Teresa Confronts the Spanish Inquisition. It's an interesting story. The Doña Teresa, we don't have an image of Don Bernardo Lopez de Mendizábal, but this is his signature. So that's close as we can get to him. Doña Teresa, we can see here, we actually have an image. She was arrested. She knew that the sheriff was coming to arrest her. Remember, the church did not arrest people. It was the secular authorities acting on behalf of the church, the Inquisition. They came in an early pre-dawn raid on the Palace of the Governors and took her into custody in the name of the Inquisition. And she and Don Bernardo and his lieutenants then were sent to Mexico City to stand trial. It took them 4 months to get there. And in the process, some of the people that were on that trip actually died. Don Bernardo, he and Doña Teresa and the 4 lieutenants arrived to Mexico City, but he died shortly after in the Inquisition jail. The cases against his lieutenants were either dismissed or given light sentences that we're not even sure were enforced. But Doña Teresa became the focus. She did have a trial, and it lasted for 2 years. And the accusations of Judaizing against her ranged from drinking chocolate on Holy Friday to bathing and changing to clean clothes for the weekend, which was soon for Saturday for Shabbat, and reading novels in a foreign language. Now, there were some other accusations, but these were some of them. Drinking chocolate on Holy Friday was seen as an indulgence, a self-indulgence that was not paying respect to the sanctity of Holy Friday. So a good Catholic wouldn't do that, so she must be a Jew. Bathing and changing clothes on Friday were known to be Jewish practices because they were getting ready for Shabbat. And reading books in a foreign language, it wasn't Spanish, was, now remember last week we talked about the thing that the expression existed, que hablo español, perdón, hablo cristiano, that Spanish was the Christian language, even though Latin was the language of the church, but Spanish in Spain was considered the Christian language. And anyone who knew other languages or would read books in another language that was not Spanish must not be a Christian. So these were the accusations against her. Now, at the end, the Inquisition could not decide that she really was a crypto Jew or converso. So they put her case into abeyance. They didn't convict her. They didn't release her. They just put it into abeyance. They let her out of jail, but it was with the condition that she could be rearrested at any time that there was any appearance of any non-Catholic behavior on her part. So what happened when a person was arrested by the Inquisition, and this happened to Doña Teresa, their goods were sequestered. They took your money, your wealth, whatever you had, they kept it. And they used it to pay for your expenses while you were in the Inquisition jail. Now, in the case of Doña Teresa, she was charged 4,000 pesos for the cost of her living in the jail for the 2 years of her trial. One unusual item in her food bill was the regular purchase of 5 kilos of chocolate every month. That's 11 pounds of chocolate. So, you know, when I first saw this, I thought, my goodness, I mean, I love chocolate, but Doña Teresa was really a chocoholic. I mean, she really did love it. Talking with friend Levine, who wrote the book on it, Fran says she thinks that maybe she was using part of this chocolate to bribe guards to get other things that she needed while she was there. So, but that was an unusual part of her billing. If the person was acquitted of the charges against them for Judaizing, their money would be given back to them. If they were convicted, the Inquisition confiscated all of their wealth and kept it. That helped fund the Inquisition, by the way. So they had an incentive to convict people. If a person's case was put into abeyance, as with Doña Teresa, they did not give the money back either. So she was left essentially in poverty for the rest of her life. Now, we see Doña Teresa here. She's appearing before the Inquisition, the inquisitors on the right, the scribe writing down all the details. And by the way, we haven't really talked about this, but the inscription records are in incredible detail. They put down every word that the inquisitor asks and every answer that the accused answers. Even to the ay-ay-ay's that are written in when the person is being tortured, even to the shouts of pain, they're written carefully into the Inquisition text. All of these records exist. And that's where we get much of our information coming out of this time period. Now, we know that in Mexico and then into New Mexico, there were practices that were regularly done by Converso families. Observing Shabbat is number one on the list. This is the one that happened most frequently by people and across a broad spectrum of geographic territories. We find it in New Mexico, we find it in Mexico, we find it in Colombia, we find it in Brazil. Observing Shabbat is something that tends to be kept. Next on the list is the appreciation, in some cases veneration, of Moses, Esther, and Job. Now, what happens here is these were Jewish figures, but they were biblical figures. So for people in the Inquisition, if you're talking about Moses and Esther and Job, it doesn't look like a Jewish event as such. And so there, in various ways, their observance was very important. Dietary laws were observed, not mixing meat and milk, killing animals in kosher-like slaughtering techniques, and not eating pork. Lighting candles on Friday night continued to be a common practice, and right into the modern period, people are still reporting their mothers and grandmothers lighting candles on Friday night, and some people still practice that. Although today people either don't practice or they go back to full Judaism, but lighting candles is a known part of that. Death rituals. The person, mirrors were covered at the person's passing. They were bathed and wrapped in a shroud and buried in virgin earth within the first day. Small stones were put on if there was a gravestone, the practice of putting small stones on it is practiced here. Marriage. There was a tendency for crypto-Jewish young people to marry within known families. This tended to keep the community together. Circumcision was widely practiced, and 80% of the men arrested for Judaizing in Mexico were reported to have been circumcised. Lastly, the continuing fear of the church. The expression "wearing the San Benito" refers. San Benito is like a cape that people had to wear if they were arrested and convicted by the Inquisition, and they were put in public exposure for this. The fear of the church extended during this time, and in New Mexico, Converso crypto-Jewish families there was a reputation for being lax in the observance of Catholic rituals, but they would attend country adobe churches like this one. This is one that exists in Las Trampas, New Mexico today. So these were the kind of places where they would have to go if they had to observe a Catholic service of some sort. Another thing that's characteristic of Converso life is the use of retablos. Now, these are modern retablos that were actually painted by Charlie Carrillo, who is of a Converso family himself, although he continues as an active Catholic. But he uses crypto-Jewish themes in his retablos frequently. Retablos were small paintings that could be purchased inexpensively by anyone, no matter what their rank was. And the one on the left that we see is Luis Carvajal in jail, in the Inquisition jail. The one in the center, of course, is Jacob and the ladder. On the right, Adam and Eve. So these themes coming out of the Jewish Bible were popular among crypto-Jewish or Converso families. And they still exist today. And we find them as we find these now with Charlie Carrillo. Now we get into the last period from the 1950s to the present, and there are some new observances that begin to come in. And a lot of these actually, we have to consider that by this time, by the mid 1800s and all the way through the 1900s, there is a continuing Jewish community, German Jewish by and large, and later Eastern European Jewish community in New Mexico. And after their arrival, we began to find families of Converso background putting Hebrew inscriptions on gravestones. I don't know if you can actually read here, but this is all Hebrew inscription here. But at the top, there's a cross. You see this, so there is this merger that's going on. They're still keeping the cross because they have to. You're going to be buried in the cemeteries were Catholic cemeteries, but then we start finding Hebrew inscriptions going back to the reference of the families. Now on the right, we see a dreidel. Sorry, missing part of the text here. The dreidel comes in with the German Jews. It did not exist in Sephardic circles. But we do begin to find hand-carved dreidels in northern New Mexico after this time period. The poet and novelist Isabel Medina Sandoval, who is of a Converso family herself, is one who perhaps can express the feeling that many of the people have. Her books, The Guardians of Hidden Traditions and Hidden Shabbat, tell about her experience from her perspective, coming from a Converso background. And I'd like to you'd follow with me here. As she writes about her own experience, she says, "On the fringe I wander, boundary of periphery, wondering just where I belong. On the outside looking in, on the inside looking out. To other Jews, my soul is in constant state of doubt. On the edge I stand, not knowing why. I do not understand." Today we have we're back to our friends that we've seen before, the descendants of Conversos and Crypto Jews in New Mexico and across Latin America today are creating new identities and cultural patterns as they adapt to the contemporary internationalized world in which there's more freedom of religion and which they can express themselves and the Jewish identity that they remember from their families. The question is how to be Jewish with a cultural heritage from the Spanish-speaking world of Jewish conversos that was predominantly a Catholic world. As individuals, they are making decisions about their lives, sometimes following individual spiritual paths. Those who chose to return to Jewish practice go through a conversion or return process, and there are a number of rabbis that are leading people through that process. Rabbi Stephen Leon in El Paso and others are leaders in this process. Those who sometimes they, in Latin America especially, they have set up their own synagogues when they were not welcomed into the Ashkenazi or Sephardi synagogues in their countries. This is true in Brazil. I've seen it in Colombia, in Mexico. The descendants of crypto Jews in the 21st century have their own unique path to life and heritage, and sometimes they build their Judaism within their own cultural sphere that they recognize. Some of the readings I mentioned that I would recommend. Last week, I mentioned Jane Gerber on the left, who did the classic book on Jews of Spain. On the right, To the End of the Earth, is the book by Stanley Hordes, the historian on crypto-Jewish experience in Mexico and New Mexico, done in wonderful detail based on his archival research in the Inquisition. On the left here, we have Doña Teresa confronts the Spanish Inquisition, which gets into detailed description of Doña Teresa's experience. And on the right is the Crypto Jews, my book, which is a survey book of this entire area that we've been discussing. And in any of those, you can find more detail than we have been able to go to in these discussions. So I'd like to stop here, and perhaps we can go to the Q&A. And Matthew, if there are questions out there.
Yes, there's a number of questions that have come in. Thank you again for such an interesting lecture. And for those of you out there, if you have more questions, please send them, and we'll get to as many as we can. And if not, we'll be able to send some to Dr. Hart. But I want to start with the question. This one, I'm sure you addressed at the beginning of your first lecture, but just in case there's people who are new, or if you want to clarify terms, there's a couple of questions just asking the difference, or there was times where there was a lack of understanding between the word converso and crypto Jew.
Okay, yeah. Okay, converso is simply the Spanish word for anybody who converts. Now, the thing is, this is the generic term, so it covers anyone who converted. We don't know if they were a crypto Jew or not, actually continuing Jewish practice. So I use converso as a generic term, referring to anyone who was Jewish and who converted formally. Now, crypto Jew specifically means people who converted or who were forced to convert and then continued Jewish practice. The practices that we talked about, observing Shabbat, dietary laws, and so on. People doing Jewish practice were crypto Jews. It is possible someone could be a converso and not continue Jewish practice. So you have that two difference. And the other part of this, I mentioned the sliding scale that would go on. There were people who at different times in their lives literally would change from one category to another. Sometimes if they were in Spanish territory, they either were not observing anything as Jewish, or they might be a crypto Jew, but then if they could go to English or Dutch territory, they could return to being a fully practicing Jew. So it's a sliding scale that goes on, but I hope that helps to define that difference.
Yeah, thank you. I think that clarifies the question. And then there's a couple about sort of the numbers today, or if there's a sense of the numbers of descendants today, and if there's likely certain surnames of descendants that people identify with.
Okay, the question of surnames, that is really a difficult one, because it was quite common when Jews converted that they changed their names to Christian names. So we have an example of Salomon Halevi changed his name to Pablo Santamaria. I know of a case of an Abulafia, which is a Jewish name, a Jewish Sephardic name, changing his name to Sanchez. And so on we go. So the thing of the names is really tricky. Some people say that all the names that end in EZ or ES are crypto-Jewish names, converso names. And that really is not true, because the EZ or the ES is actually an adaptation coming out of Latin, which simply means the son of. So Rodriguez is the son of Rodrigo. Sanchez is the son of Sancho. These are not Jewish names. The Jewish names that existed in Spain and in Portugal, and the truly Jewish names, were Abulafia, Abravanel, Signor, and I mean, Halevi was a common name. So they were recognizable Jewish names. But today, that's a very tricky business. In terms of how many conversos, how many people of converso crypto-Jewish descent there were in Mexico, of course, there's no census of this. We don't know historically how many there were. There were several thousands in Mexico. If I've tried to do the demographics about how this would project into the current period, and it could be that there are several 100,000 descendants of those original conversos or crypto Jews in Mexico. We don't know an exact number, but probably several 100,000. It might be 1 million. We don't know for sure the exact number, but it's something in that range probably, based on the demographic projections that I've been able to make out of the number of people that were in Mexico at the time and the population growth that has occurred up to the present.
Yeah, that's a lot of people potentially today. As a follow-up, there's a question about what percentage of the settlers, I guess whether Portuguese or Spanish in the Americas, of the broader population. Do we have a sense of how that percentage of the number of conversos?
In the total population?
Yeah, in the total.
Well, okay, the thing is, we know we have no exact numbers on this because there were no census at this time. At the time of the expulsion from Spain, the estimates are the Jewish population at that point was around 1 to 2% of the total Spanish population. So it's a tiny percentage. Now, if you would assume that a larger percentage came to the Americas, that they had a larger presence than they would have had in Spain. So let's say, that percentage moved up to 5%, or if we want to go really high, 10%. We know that in Mexico, in the 1600s, there were about 250,000 Spaniards. Now, if we're talking about 5%, that could have been 12,000 conversos. So we're talking in the thousands, but a fairly limited number. It's difficult to make these population projections. I've just recently been studying the slave trade in Cartagena, where the Portuguese were heavily involved. And one firm piece of data I was able to come up with, they were studying 8 slave ships that arrived in a period of 1 year into the port of Cartagena, all of which had Portuguese owners of the slaves. There were 30 Portuguese owners that owned parts of these the different the slaves were on these different 8 ships. Of those, 10 of them were arrested by the Inquisition as being crypto Jews. Now, again, these are not totally firm answers, but in that case, we had 1/3 of the slave trafficking merchants were crypto Jewish, all of them Portuguese. So, but that's a higher number, I think, than would be in the normal population. But but these are some of the numbers we can look at,
Yeah, there's actually on the subject of slave trade, there's actually a number of questions again this week on the subject. So I think your answer there addresses some of them. I just want to, if there's anything else you've learned in your recent research, I think our audience is interested in that subject, such as the percentage of slave traders, or if there were objections by different parts of the Jewish community or parts of the Converso community. Anything else you've learned from your research, I think would be of interest.
Yeah. This question comes up all the time. Like, weren't people protesting? And there were people protesting that the slave trade was not an acceptable thing. As I think I mentioned last week, the slave trade was a very profitable trade. People had high returns on investment. Their returns were astronomical, and so that was a temptation for people to get into it, even though there was opposition to it. And it wasn't only the Portuguese in Latin America who were doing this, but the Portuguese in Newport were doing it. As I mentioned, Ron Lopez. So the Newport community also was involved in what they called the triangle trade, which was Newport, Africa, the West Indies, and then back to Newport. Ron Lopez produced rum in the barrels, which he would ship to Africa and sell there, and use the proceeds to buy slaves, go back to the West Indies, leave the slaves, buy sugar, and that would come back to Newport. So, I mean, this is a very difficult thing for us to look at today, but it is something that existed in the 1600s and into the 1700s,
Yeah, thank you. On the subject, I guess, of writing to other peoples, there's a question about Converso Jews and the relationship with American Indians, or the native populations that were. This one person noted that they heard in a different lecture that Native Americans shared their secret of chocolate with the Jews because the Jews were not interested in taking their land, just trading. I'm not sure if that's something you've heard before or can address, but thanks.
Well, of course, the issue is that the Jewish experience of being the outsiders gave a different perspective. The Jews were not normally involved in imposing the crown policies. They certainly were not supporting the Inquisition. So Jews in the Americas had a different relationship to this, because they were not official representatives. They didn't represent the Spanish crown, and so in that kind of way, it's true that the relationship with Native Americans would have been different. And even in the case of slaves, I mean, we know that Jewish plantation owners had slaves, but at least part of the information we have suggests that the treatment was not as bad as it could be under other circumstances. So I don't know. I don't have exact answers on that, but that maybe gives some perspective.
Thank you. Yeah. There's a number of questions. And one of them, and maybe I don't know if you could speak to it or not, but there's another question about Jewish pirates and whether or not some of those were crypto or Converso in their practice or in their heritage.
Yes, yeah. There were, well, what we call today Jewish pirates, but the actual fact at the time, this practice actually started in the Mediterranean. Now later we find it in the Caribbean, but in the Mediterranean, it was the Ottoman Empire that was funding Jewish ship captains to interfere with Spanish shipping. Now, the Spanish had expelled the Jews. So from the Jewish perspective, this was not piracy, this was retaliation against Spanish shipping. We find the same thing happening in the Americas, and it's the Dutch and the English who are funding and supporting and giving support for the Jewish pirates. For example, we know, some of you have read the book Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean, which is an interesting account of this time period, this phenomenon. We know, for example, that what's called Spanish Town in Jamaica today was it was a Sephardic settlement, and there were ship captains there who were dedicated to raiding Spanish shipping. Now, they were called pirates. It's not the Johnny Depp type pirate that you think of. I mean, these are people who are interrupting Spanish shipping, and if they would get lucky and get the transport that was taking the silver back to Spain, that was a great thing for them. But they were more in the vein of Sir Francis Drake and other sea captains of that sort, who were essentially fighting against the Spanish, and they were using the maritime skills that they had to do that. So yes, there were Spanish pirates, but don't think Johnny Depp, you know.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. And on another subject, were conversos arrested for Judaizing, who maybe didn't even know what they were doing was considered Jewish, such as in this example here, if a child was circumcised and then they, the family converted, they didn't, maybe, I don't know how often circumcision was used, but I imagine that could be an example at a trial later in life.
Sure. Yes, it did happen. And the Inquisition didn't really, I don't think the Inquisition cared that much whether the person truly was a Jewish practitioner or was just a converso who got caught in the roundup. Because part of what the Inquisition wanted to do was to make a public statement to the rest of the community. So, and sometimes under torture, people would confess to Judaizing just to get out of the torture. I mean, the torture was incredible. They did things, one of the things that we think of as a modern CIA technique today, which waterboarding, the Inquisition was using that 500 years ago. They used the rack, which essentially take the arms and the legs, and as they pull the rack, it literally pulled the person apart. They had other terrible tortures. So we know there must have been cases where people would confess to Judaizing just to get out of the pain of the torture. Again, we don't know how many that would apply to, but it surely happened. And to the Inquisition, as long as they had an arrest. So you see, once the Inquisition could arrest you and then convict you, they got to confiscate your property. So, whether you were really practicing Jewish or not, it was a win-win for the Inquisition if they got a confession out of you.
Yeah. So I imagine on that note, there are the majority of, or a greater majority of people who went to trial had means of some sort or something for the church to take. Is that pretty universal?
Yeah, because what you see, the example we were given from Mexico is we know there were several thousand Converso families, crypto Jews there. 130 were arrested in that roundup at the end. And the 130 that were arrested were the ones that had more capital. They were the leaders. It tended to be the wealthier part. The Inquisition, I mean, once in a while they would arrest a person who was a common sailor, or, I mean, that did happen. But the actual fact is, it was better for the Inquisition to arrest the leaders who were wealthy, because that would fund them well into the future. There's a famous case from Peru, from Lima. The man who owned a very large concession in silver mining and was widely considered the wealthiest man in Lima, was arrested by the Inquisition, and it was convicted of Judaizing, and I think in his case burned at the stake. But all of his possessions were confiscated. Now, we actually have the record. We know that what they did when the property was confiscated, it was auctioned off later, and then the results would go to the Inquisition. The chief inquisitor in Lima sent an agent to bid on all the things that were being auctioned, and apparently won a good part of it. So here was a chief inquisitor who was actually profiting personally from the wealth of this Jewish merchant who had been convicted. And he was known later to have been riding around Lima in a silver gilded carriage. The Inquisitioner, after he after he won the auction and got the best of the property of this man, could ride around Lima in a silver carriage. People accused him of being greedy, and his response to the greed was he was only doing what needed to be done, and that the fact that he benefited from it was secondary matter. Oh yes, you have those cases.
Yeah, thank you. I want to shift a little bit to today, and there's a number of questions about the communities today, and I guess on two sides of it. What efforts are being made on behalf of Jews in these communities in New Mexico, or to reach out to families who I guess either are conversos, or thinking about their identity, and also synagogues that maybe are resistant to those who are interested in identifying as Jewish or moving in that direction.
Yes. Let me mention the positive ones first. The person who really is a leader in this area is Rabbi Stephen Leon in El Paso, in a conservative synagogue there, B'nai Zion. For a number of years, he has had an outreach process in which he's been quite open to people who want to return to the practice of Judaism from Spanish-speaking backgrounds. And in fact, the synagogue over the years has now become largely people who are returnees. Some of the leaders in the synagogue, such as John Garcia, leads services there. He's fluent in Hebrew. President of the board of directors of the synagogue of Spanish Converso background. So Rabbi Leon has really been outstanding in this respect. But there are others. There are in Albuquerque, for example, Nahalat Shalom, the congregation, is one that is open to and celebrates people returning from the Converso background. And another interesting thing that is happening, both in cases that I know in Brazil and Colombia and in Mexico, there are rabbis who are working with people who want to make their return to Judaism. There are problems with being accepted by traditional synagogues. So one of the things that has happened is that people have literally set up their own synagogues with their own cultural sphere. In one suburb of Medellin, Colombia, a suburb called Bello, there is a complete community that has been set up that includes a kosher bakery, a school, regular Hebrew lessons. They've sent the rabbis to Israel to study, to make sure they're properly trained. So you have these kinds of cases. one of the problems, and one of the problems about people coming out of a converso background, synagogues in Latin America frequently are smaller. And family ties and language are frequently a part of what it means to be in the synagogue. It's being in a community. So the community maybe is people who have working relationships together. In Latin America, you have Sephardic synagogues that tend to be people who come from the Ottoman Empire, Ashkenazi synagogues that tend to be people who come from Eastern Europe, and they separate into different synagogues because they really are separate communities. One is Yiddish speaking, one is Judeo-Spanish speaking. And so when a person is coming out of a converso background, comes into this environment, they have neither the family contacts, they're not in the same business circles usually, they don't have the same cultural or linguistic background. So there's a major cultural problem of people coming into communities that are sometimes fairly closely knit communities in which they don't fit. So, so you have this phenomenon of people setting up their own synagogues with their own group of people, and that has become a phenomenon there.
Yeah, I imagine the the different experiences over the centuries really define the communities. So it's difficult. I'm glad to hear that they're able to set up their own and hopefully continue to get some support from the broader Jewish community and going forward. In there's a question here, and if you're familiar with it, you can let me know if you're not familiar. But in other are you familiar with what's happening maybe with conversos returning in other Latin American countries such as Jamaica or in the Caribbean? Are there other movements in other parts of Central America?
Yes, I've heard of individual cases. Now, I don't know to what extent there's like a complete movement, but Puerto Rico is a case in question. So there are in the Caribbean, this does exist. One of the things the Jewish Federation in New Mexico, when the laws of return to Spain and Portugal were passed in 2015, where people who were of converso Sephardic background could get Spanish citizenship or Portuguese citizenship. I was president of the Jewish Federation in New Mexico during part of that period, and we had large numbers we had people from Puerto Rico writing with their stories of their families. They're incredible stories, incredible. We had thousands of people making inquiries about this, coming out of, many of them coming out of the Caribbean basin, including Venezuela and Colombia and Mexico and so on. So I saw literally thousands of individual stories about their backgrounds coming out of this. There is a young woman anthropologist at the University of New Mexico today who's actually doing a study of these cases for her PhD dissertation. And we look forward to the results that I think that they will be quite interesting.
Yeah, yes, thank you. We'll be interested to learn more about that at a future time. But
let me mention one thing if I can. From last week, I remember there was a question about Ladino, the language. If I could, we didn't get to it last week. When the Jews were expelled from Spain and they went basically around the Mediterranean basin, either somewhere in Eastern Europe, but either North Africa or the Ottoman Empire at the eastern end, they carried with them the 16th century, 15th to 16th century Spanish that they had. And what happens to immigrant populations is once you're away from the mother tongue, the language tends to stagnate. You tend to keep using the same language that had been used well before. So that happened in the Sephardic diaspora around the Mediterranean basin. They kept speaking 15th century Spanish, essentially. And with that, they would eventually add in some Hebrew expressions, and they would be added into the language. Someone explained it to me once that we can think about it ourselves. In our English, if we were still speaking Elizabethan English, for example, and we were adding in Yiddish and Hebrew words today, like schlep and kosher and all of those, that if over time doing that, we would develop a Judeo-English language. Okay, that's what happened to Judeo-Spanish. They kept the old style language. Hebrew words kept coming in. And in fact, what they tended to do was actually to write this language in Hebrew characters. So it's called al-Hamiado. And so these are the languages that in the Ottoman Empire came to be called Ladino. Ladino is the Turkish version of Judeo-Spanish. The Moroccan version is called Hakatiya. There were other names that were Españolite, Judesmo were other names for Judeo-Spanish dialects like this that developed. So that language was a language in the diaspora, not in Spain, but in the diaspora. And Ladino is the Ottoman Empire version of it. So anyway, I hope that explains a little bit about the Ladino question that came up last week.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, there was actually another question this week. There's many more questions that we'll be able to get to, but I kind of, with a few minutes left, I want to, there's some questions just about how the Jewish practice was transmitted through the generations. And I remember reading in your book, there's a nice story at the end about the family who brings the tefillin to the rabbi. And I know it's just one anecdotal story. I mean, it's a nice story. So if you want to share that one or anything else about how it was, how the other practices were continued through some generations.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yes, the story of the tefillin is an interesting one, and it's with Rabbi Leon that I mentioned before. And he tells the story of, and actually he carries this tefillin with him all the time. I know him personally. We have a lot of interaction, and he carries this with him. In his office one day, a family arrived, Spanish-speaking people who were from Los Angeles, but they had been, as I remember, to the graduation of the grandson someplace in Texas. And they were returning back to Los Angeles driving. And the grandmother with her daughter, I mean, the mother with her daughter and the husband, the grandmother said at one point as they were going through El Paso, she said, I want to stop here because I want to find a rabbi. Her children were confused. They didn't know why. Maybe her grandmother, the mother was a Catholic, always had been a Catholic. Why did she want to find a rabbi? They didn't know. So they happened to stop precisely at the intersection that led up to the congregation B'nai Zion, the conservative congregation where Rabbi Leon is. They stopped at a gas station, they got directions, they drove up there, went to his office, and the older woman said, I have something very important I have to share with you. So they came in, they sat down. And so she began telling her story that her grandfather, when he was passing away, asked her to make sure that he gave her these boxes, Jewish boxes. She didn't know what they were, but they were Jewish boxes, holy boxes. She asked he asked that one of them be put in the coffin with him when he was buried. And he asked her, for some reason, that she keep the other one as long as she lived and have it buried with her when she died. So the thing is that she was ill at this point, and she was not sure about how long she was going to live. And she told Rabbi Leon, she said, you know, I'm a Catholic. I'm really not Jewish. This is something that I think should be for a Jewish holy person. I know it's a holy object. So she opened her purse and took out the other half, the tefillin, the other part of the tefillin that she had, and gave it to him. And she asked him, will you keep this in honor of my grandfather, and will you have it buried with you? Because that's what he would have wanted. So Rabbi Leon said, of course, that he did. So these are the kind of stories that happen. Steve Frank, I think it was, wrote after the first talk and mentioned he was flying to Albuquerque at one point on the plane, and he was reading something that had to do with conversos. And the woman next to him apparently saw what he's reading and said to him, I'm converso. I'm of a converso descent. So you have these things happen in this part of the country. The experience is there. Rabbi Leon goes on to tell, when he first became rabbi in El Paso, because his name was Leon, everybody thought he was Spanish. He's actually Polish. He had no idea that there was any Sephardic connection in Poland. He thought it was a Polish name. He arrived to El Paso, and in the first 3 weeks, he had a number of cases of people coming to him, telling him their story of being of a Jewish background. So this, there are many stories of this type.
Yeah, thank you. For me, just like one of the, the amazing lecture and answers, and for me, one of the enduring questions that I'm left with from these lectures is just how is the question of who is a Jew, and how what experiences lead you to sort of like the type of Judaism. And in some of our previous lectures, we haven't uncovered it quite in the depth that we have here with this subject, but we've seen in the Second Temple period with the different Jewish sects, and we had a program about Ethiopian Jews, and so it's interesting to see different experiences leading to different community, like old Jewish communities lead to new experiences and building new communities over the millennia. So that's one of the thoughts that I'm left with, and I imagine our audience is left with many new thoughts and insights. So I appreciate that. And if you have any final thoughts, we're about out of time here. So anything you want to leave us with?
Just in reference to what you were saying now, the return to Judaism movement, which we're seeing across Latin America, has some related phenomena that are occurring in other parts of the world. We know the Ethiopian experience, of course, the Limba in Africa, who identify as being Jewish, a tribe, African tribe, and actually apparently have the Koine gene appearing in their population. The B'nai Menashe in India, who identify with Jewish heritage and are migrating, several thousand have migrated to Israel. In Kaifeng, China, the descendants, because Jewish traders on the Silk Route, the eastern end of the Silk Route was Kaifeng, and there was a Jewish population there hundreds of years back, and there are descendants of those Jewish merchants who today are reclaiming their Jewish heritage. So we have this very interesting phenomenon, and it's a different question to get into. Why today? Why do we have these? The Converso Crypto Jewish group is a large one in Latin America, but then we see Africa, we see India, we see China. There is a phenomenon of people looking to the Jewish experience as one that they can identify with and see it in their roots, and are in the process of reclaiming in various kinds of ways. So it's a very interesting international phenomenon of the Jewish identity movement.
Yeah, it's amazing, I guess, what opportunity Jews around the world or their descendants have to think about their identity. into the
Yeah.
future. So thank you again, Dr. Hart. It was a pleasure working with you, and I've greatly enjoyed these lectures. So thank you, and thank you all out there for joining us. I look forward to seeing you at one of our upcoming programs. So have a wonderful evening.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.